Jen, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me on.
It's good to finally have you on. So you tackle so many issues, but I want to try and narrow it down to a few here if I can do it. You founded and had the organization Crushing Colonialism. Can you talk for a minute about your goals with that organization and how you go about achieving those goals?
So we are an international indigenous multimedia collective, and what we do is we use media, different forms of media as a way to advance Native and indigenous issues across the world. And so the way in which we do that is we're not necessarily a news site, but we support indigenous media makers. So this can be sculptors, writers who do lit, it can be documentarians, journalists like myself. And the idea is to help us get better jobs, get better wages, get the fellowships, get the grants, get the supports that we need to do this work. Part of what led me to this was just my own work in journalism as a freelancer and feeling like I didn't have a lot of supports as a result of being freelance. And you know, the only news coverage we have in the US is 0.01% on Native people. That's all the news coverage we receive. So it's really important that we are supporting indigenous media makers.
So that's great. So it serves as kind of a signal boost for media makers out there. So as you just mentioned, Native American issues get very little to no news coverage. One that did become kind of a national story in the past year was Elizabeth Warren running for president. She releases her DNA testing showing she's, I don't know if it was like 1% Native or something. And even now, today, almost every week, Donald Trump has some mention where he calls her Pocahontas, where he somehow is managing to both be insulting to her and insulting to Native Americans all at the same time. But you know, what Warren did is also insulting. So talk about both of these factors and what they mean.
Well, I mean, first I want to start by saying that the average American, the average non-Native American rather, doesn't know really anything about us. Our schools don't teach our history, they don't teach an accurate history, and they often don't teach past the 1800s. You know, it's not rare for me to encounter people who are surprised that Native people still exist. You know, I often hear people refer to us in the past tense as if we're all dead. And unfortunately, a lot of us were murdered under settler colonialism and genocide, but we are still here. And these DNA tests don't actually prove indigeneity. They're racist pseudoscience. You can't actually prove ethnicity or race on these tests. And furthermore, the part that I think a lot of people don't really understand is that Native people, while we've been racialized through white supremacy and colonialism, we're actually distinct sovereign nations. And that's something very different than just being an ethnic or racial group.
Right.
So DNA tests, regardless of what they say, are never going to prove indigeneity. It's never going to show the tribal nation. And it's really insulting for me as somebody who is a citizen of Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma to know what my ancestors went through. You know, 1/3 of our people died on the trail where they cried. You know, and what people also don't understand is it wasn't just the removal from our land. There were hundreds of years of mass rape, murder, villages being burned, our children being murdered and slaughtered, long before that removal even happened. So we already have all of this trauma on top of us. Then we lose our land in the southeast. We get moved to present-day Oklahoma, then referred to as Indian Territory. And not even 100 years later, Oklahoma statehood occurred, and they did the land run where non-Native people, mostly white people from all over the world, not even just America, came, lined up at a starting point, a pistol fired, and they went off and literally stuck a stake in the ground and said, "This is mine."
Right, literally the American government just said, if you get out there at this particular time, you can just have the land.
Right, so this is the second time we've had our land taken from us, and Warren's family is a part of this history. So not only is she not Cherokee, but her family has taken an active role in our genocide. Rebecca Nagel, who's also a citizen of Cherokee Nation, just came out with an article talking about Warren's family and how they came, one of her family members went to Tennessee and took part in murdering us. And then they went to Oklahoma and took our land there. So for me, as someone whose family and ancestors have suffered this genocide, I'm watching how my people are still suffering to this day. We have the highest rates of sexual assault, kidnapping, trafficking, murder by police, the worst health care. I mean, these issues go on. And to see someone like Warren, who has no claims to us, no ties to us, is not one of us, turn around and use our identity as a way to further her education and career, well, that's just a slap in the face to every Indigenous person.
And you're one of the, you were telling me before, you're one of the few Native journalists that's even gotten to question her. Did she respond to your questions?
She did. She was quite smug, I have to say. I just happened to be at the right time, at the right place. Warren was at an event speaking at a National Congress of American Indians event last year, and I just happened to get a few questions in with her. And my last question was asking her, what about your claims to Cherokee Nation? And she very arrogantly said, I know who my family is. And I will never forget that.
Which is like a non-answer, really.
Right. And, I lived in Massachusetts for years. Before I started working in journalism, I worked in politics. I ran campaigns for, further left Democrats and liberal organizations. I have never heard this woman ever say anything about Native people until she decided to run for office, or for the presidency.
Yeah, and as you're kind of making this point that even if the DNA testing had said something completely different, that's not enough to advocate for. You have to. It's the actions. It's what you stand for. Barack Obama is African American, but what he did for the African American community in this nation as president was just about zero. Nothing on police brutality. Nothing on prison industrial complex. The drug war. Our white supremacist bombing overseas. And so, does that still make him some sort of savior of the African American community? I'd say not.
Absolutely not. I mean, we do have some Native people in Congress right now. We have our first 2 Native American women ever to be elected in Congress. But we have had some Native men in Congress for quite some time. But they're all Republicans, and they're very far right. So being Native does not necessarily mean that you're going to do right by Native people. And I understand, particularly for our tribal government leaders, they're in this sort of precarious position where they don't want to make America angry. So they kind of have to kiss the ass of American politicians.
Try and fit in.
Right, in the hopes that we'll get the funding we deserve and that maybe our treaties will be honored. But when I hear Natives saying that Warren is good for us, that's really harmful, and that's really painful. And it continues to tell other non-Natives that it's okay what she's doing. I know, I'll speak for myself, as I have spoken out against Warren, I've been called a Russian, GOP, a bot, told to leave America. I've had a white person tell me, well, Natives just have to wait.
Wait for what?
Yeah. I'm like, we've been waiting for over 500 years.
Right.
I'm not waiting anymore.
Right.
I'm demanding and taking what my people deserve.
So to slightly shift gears, but still something that has been a mainstream story has been these pipeline fights that are ongoing in many parts of the country. Pipelines and the fossil fuels and climate change getting us to the point where we're kind of on the brink of extinction if we don't do something soon. That seems like an issue that impacts all of us. Why is it such a Native-specific fight? It seems like a lot of the time.
I think part of that is that we're the ones that feel the greatest impact of global climate chaos. It's our remaining lands that have some of the world's largest uranium deposits, oil. And then these pipelines, when their routes are planned, they often go right by reservations or reserves or tribal villages. So it's directly impacting us.
I remember this in North Dakota. They were planning on going through a mostly white area, kind of people, suburbanites, people with money. And then they realized, politically, that's difficult. So we'll shift gears and go through Standing Rock.
Yeah, and that is common. We see it in Canada. We see it throughout the so-called Americas. We see this in other lands like Australia. They have the world's largest uranium deposit on Aboriginal land there. So this is a really severe problem for us. We already have people like the Ile de Jean Charles Nation who are climate refugees. Like their land is almost gone from the rising seawater. So I think that's part of why we're the ones that are often on the front lines, but it's also because our spirituality, our culture, our religion, our food, our language, our ways are so intrinsically tied to our lands. And I think a lot of non-natives don't understand that. For us, it's not going to a church or a synagogue or mosque, it's being on our land.
Right.
And seeing that harmed or not having access to it means that we can't practice our religions freely.
Right. So I guess that's part of a factor is most or maybe all, forgive my ignorance, I don't know, but native belief systems seem to view the natural world as either a mother or a provider or something, whereas, capitalism views it as just something to be exploited until it's dead.
Right. Yeah. I mean, make money at all costs, which that will often mean sacrificing the earth and sacrificing marginalized people. I've covered quite a bit on different pipelines.
Yeah, can you talk about the Mountain Valley Pipeline, where that stands now?
Yeah, so I was just out at the Yellowfinch camp a few weeks ago. That's in a western part of Virginia on the route for Mountain Valley Pipeline. So MVP is around 300 miles. It's going to move highly volatile, highly pressured fracked gas through a 42-inch diameter pipeline that's going over very steep mountains. This is the first pipeline of this magnitude to go through southern Appalachia. They've already had a lot of problems with sediment and erosion not being properly controlled, so people's water are getting contaminated. There have been, I believe, about 40 arrests so far. As we often saw with Dakota Access Pipeline and other pipeline fights, the police are very deeply in cahoots with MVP.
Yeah.
I've heard that some of the police actually, when they're off work security for the pipeline.
Right.
Which,
off work. Yeah.
Yeah, which is not uncommon. That fight it's still ongoing. It's going to be ongoing for a while, and there are multiple fronts that it's occurring. There are the tree sits at Yellowfinch Camp. They've, people out there resisting this pipeline have done monopods, sky pods, and then there's multiple legal battles around various permits that have been pulled. I think one of the things that's very telling about this particular pipeline is that FERC actually pulled a permit. And FERC is essentially just a rubber stamping agency.
Yeah, FERC, for those who don't know, FERC is the regulatory commission that decides whether pipelines can go through or not, but the 99% or something of the permits are all approved.
Right.
Yeah, so, that will definitely be an ongoing fight. In these last couple of minutes, I wanted to move to the issue of monuments, which has become a kind of national fight. Much of it is talked about Confederate monuments, but there's something else to be said here about, monuments and how they show how much we value or don't value Native Americans in our society.
I think that, it's obviously anti-Native, but it's, of course, also anti-Black. There's a lot of problems with these things. When I have to go over by the White House for, rallies or just walking through the area, I have to see a statue of President Andrew Jackson. That's the man responsible for my people's removal.
Right.
He was a slave owner. He was a horrible human being, yet here is this monument right next to the White House, which is ironic that that's the name of it, considering it's on stolen Native land and was built by Black slaves. But there has been a particular fight recently that is in San Francisco. There's a mural. It's called Pioneer Mural, and it's on the wall of a public high school there. And this mural is just awful. It's depicting natives, being murdered, and white people taking over and being these great conquerors. And so there was a fight to try to get this mural removed, and unfortunately, there were some votes recently, and the mural is going to stay. So, when I walk through any part of America every day, I see some way in which colonizers are being upheld, whether it's me going to the grocery store and having to see somebody wearing the DC football team.
That's amazing that I don't know, still exists. Like the fight bubbles up every couple of years, and then it just, the football team remains being called what it is.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't even understand what that word is or why it's so problematic to use Native people as mascots. But I also don't think they really understand the trauma that comes with it. You know, living in DC and having to see people wearing, you know, having stickers on their cars or wearing T-shirts and things that have a disembodied Native head on it.
Right.
That has a word that literally only exists from when the U.S. government paid white men to kill us. Like, that's really traumatic, and I don't think people understand the depths that goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you know, if it were a word that derogatory about so many other groups, it would be taken down in a second.
Yeah.
You know, there's certain words that are equivalent that we can't say in public for good reason.
Right.
And yet this is the name of a football team. Anyway, we're out of time here, but the organization is Crushing Colonialism. How can people keep up with your work?
So they can go to crushingcolonialism.org, learn a little bit about us, sign up to follow us. We have, of course, Facebook page, Instagram, Twitter. And so people can follow us, see what we're doing that way. They can also make donations to help us keep going. Because as I said, only 0.01% of news coverage is on Indigenous issues, but only 0.02% of philanthropic giving goes to Native organizations, and only 0.02% of that goes to Indigenous media.
Well, thank you so much for doing your part to change that and to make people aware.
Yeah, thank you.